Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet hour. As the day settles into stillness and the world around you grows peaceful, let these words carry you gently toward rest. Tonight we journey through ancient stories of fire and light, through moments when the divine touched the earth in flame and radiance. Let your breathing slow, your body relax, and your mind drift softly through these sacred encounters. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the story unfold like a gentle stream flowing towards sleep. The sun hung low over the Sinai desert, painting the rocky hills in shades of amber and rose. Moses walked slowly behind his father-in-law's flock, his staff tapping against the ancient stones with each measured step. The sheep moved lazily in the cooling air, their bells creating a soft melody that had become the rhythm of his days. 40 years had passed since he fled from Egypt. 40 years of this quiet life among the rocks and thorns, tending animals that asked nothing of him but patience and presence. He had grown accustomed to the silence of these wild places. The desert spoke in whispers, in the rustle of wind through dried grass, in the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. Sometimes Moses wondered if he had imagined his earlier life entirely, those years in Pharaoh's palace, the education, the privilege, the sense that he might have been destined for something significant. That life seemed like a dream now, faded and uncertain, belonging to someone else entirely. The flock wandered toward the base of a mountain, and Moses followed without thinking, his mind drifting as it often did during these long afternoons. He thought about his wife Zipporah, waiting in their tent, about their sons who were growing so quickly, about the simple rhythms of this pastoral existence that had become his whole world. There was peace in it, he had to admit, even if sometimes that peace felt like a kind of forgetting. The sheep stopped moving, clustering together and bleating softly. Moses looked up, pulled from his thoughts by their unusual behavior. Something had caught their attention, or perhaps made them nervous. He squinted against the slanting sunlight, scanning the rocky slopes for predators, for anything that might threaten the flock. Then he saw it. In a small clearing between two large boulders, a bush was burning. At first this seemed unremarkable. Desert plants sometimes caught fire in the intense heat, sparked by lightning or the friction of dry branches. But as Moses watched, he realized something was deeply strange about this fire. The flames rose bright and clear, dancing in the still air, yet the branches of the bush remained green and whole. The fire burned without consuming, without destroying, without diminishing the living wood that fed it. Moses stood very still, his heart beginning to beat faster. He had seen many things in 40 years of desert wandering, had learned to read the sky for weather, the ground for water, the behavior of animals for danger. But he had never seen anything like this. The fire seemed to exist outside the normal laws of nature, sustained by something beyond the material world. It was beautiful and terrible at once, compelling and frightening in equal measure. He took a step forward, then another. The sheep forgotten, Moses moved toward the burning bush, as though drawn by invisible hands. His mouth felt dry, his palms damp against the smooth wood of his staff. The fire grew brighter as he approached, but gave off no heat, no smoke, no sound of crackling wood. It simply burned, pure and constant, a flame that seemed to have no beginning and promised no end. When he was perhaps 20 paces away, Moses stopped. Something in him knew that he stood at a threshold, that whatever happened next would change everything. Part of him wanted to turn back, to return to his sheep and his simple life, to the safety of not knowing, not seeing, not being called. But he could not look away from the flame. It held him with a power beyond curiosity, beyond fear, beyond anything he could name. Then the fire spoke. The voice came from within the flame, or perhaps from everywhere at once, echoing off the rocks and resonating in Moses' chest. It called his name, not once but twice, with a tenderness that made his knees weak. Moses, Moses. The sound of it was like recognition, like being seen fully for the first time, like coming home to a place he had never been. Moses dropped to his knees without thinking, his staff falling from his hands. The ground beneath him suddenly felt sacred, charged with a presence he could not comprehend but could not deny. His voice, when he found it, was barely a whisper. "Here I am." The voice from the flame spoke again, gentle but commanding, intimate yet vast. "Do not come any closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." With trembling hands, Moses reached down and untied his sandals, pulling them from his feet and setting them aside. The rocky earth felt cool against his skin, grounding him even as everything he understood about the world seemed to shift and reform. Holy ground. He was standing on holy ground. Not in a temple, not in a city, not in any place set apart by human hands, but here, in this forgotten corner of the wilderness, before a bush that burned with an eternal flame. The presence that spoke from the fire identified itself, claiming connection to his ancestors, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to the ancient promises and covenants that Moses had heard about in stories but never quite believed were real. The flame seemed to pulse with each word, as though the fire itself was shaped by the speaking, as though light and language were somehow the same thing. Moses covered his face, unable to look directly at the burning bush any longer. The glory of it was too much, too bright, too pure for his eyes to bear. But even with his face hidden, he could feel the warmth of that presence, not the heat of physical fire, but something else, something that seemed to burn away the accumulated dust of 40 years, the layers of disappointment and resignation, the belief that his life had already been decided and could never be anything more than what it was. The voice continued, and now it spoke of suffering, of people crying out under oppression, of a promise unfulfilled and a deliverance that was coming. Moses listened, his heart pounding, understanding slowly dawning that this was not just a vision, not just a moment of mystical experience to be treasured and remembered. This was a calling. This was a commission. This fire had not appeared simply to be seen, but to send. The message was clear and impossible. Go back to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, lead the people out of slavery and into freedom. Take them to the land that had been promised generations ago, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that seemed more myth than reality. You, Moses, who fled in disgrace, who have spent 40 years hiding in the wilderness, who have almost succeeded in becoming nobody at all, you are the one who will do this. Moses felt panic rising in his chest, felt all his old inadequacies flooding back. His mind raced with objections, with perfectly reasonable explanations for why this could not possibly work, why he could not possibly be the right person. He was no one now, a shepherd, a fugitive, a man who had failed spectacularly at everything he had ever attempted. The people would not listen to him. Pharaoh would not fear him. He did not even speak well, had never had the gift of eloquence that such a task would surely require. But the fire continued to burn, steady and patient, and the presence that spoke from within it answered every objection with promises that seemed both reassuring and terrifying. I will be with you. I will teach you what to say. I will show you signs and wonders. I will do what seems impossible through your inadequate hands and stumbling words. This is not about your strength or your ability. This is about my presence, my power, my purposes that will not be thwarted by human weakness or fear. Moses asked the question that seemed most important, the question that got to the heart of everything. Who are you? If I go to the people and tell them that the God of their fathers has sent me, they will ask me your name. What shall I tell them? The flame seemed to grow brighter, and the answer came with a weight that Moses felt in his bones, a declaration that was both simple and infinitely profound. I am who I am. Tell them that I am has sent you. I am. Not I was, not I will be, but I am. Eternal presence, existence itself, the ground of all being. The name was less a label than a reality, a truth that encompassed all truths, a being that could not be captured in words or concepts because it was the source of all words, all concepts, all existence. Moses knelt before the burning bush and understood, in a way that went beyond understanding, that he was in the presence of the divine, the eternal, the one who simply is. The conversation continued as the sun moved lower in the sky, painting the desert in deeper shades of purple and gold. Moses spoke his fears aloud, each objection rising from a place of honest doubt. What if they don't believe me? What if they say no vision appeared, no God spoke, that I am making all of this up? The flame flickered gently, and the voice responded with patience, offering signs and assurances, building his faith word by word, promise by promise. Moses felt something shifting inside him, a slow transformation that was painful and beautiful at once. The man who had fled Egypt in shame, who had buried his past in the sand and tried to forget he had ever been anything other than a shepherd, that man was being called back to life. Not to the life he had lost, but to something new, something he could not yet imagine. The fire was not just speaking to him, but working in him, burning away the old certainties, the comfortable resignation, the safety of invisibility. Still he resisted, not out of defiance, but out of the deep human fear of being insufficient, of failing again, of disappointing both the divine caller and the people he was meant to serve. He thought of his brother Aaron, still in Egypt, wondering if perhaps someone else, someone more capable, more eloquent, more everything, should be the one to go. The words tumbled out almost desperately. Please, Lord, send someone else. The flame dimmed slightly, and Moses felt rather than heard a kind of divine sigh, a patience tested but not broken. The voice acknowledged his brother, agreed that Aaron could speak for him, that he would not be alone in this impossible task. But the calling remained. Moses would go. Moses would stand before Pharaoh. Moses would lead the people out. Not because he was adequate, but because the presence that burned in that bush would go with him, would speak through him, would accomplish through his weakness what could never be done through human strength alone. As the conversation drew to a close, Moses realized that the fire had become familiar somehow, that his terror had transformed into something closer to awe, and his awe into something almost like trust. He still did not understand how any of this would work, still could not see the path ahead, but he believed now that the flame spoke truth, that the I Am who burned without consuming would also sustain without failing. The voice gave him final instructions, told him what signs to perform, what words to speak, how to begin the impossible task that lay ahead. Then gradually the voice grew quieter, the flame less intense, though it did not go out. Moses remained on his knees for a long time after the speaking ended, his face still covered, his heart full of feelings too complex to name. Fear and hope, inadequacy and calling, doubt and faith, all tangled together like threads in a weaving whose pattern he could not yet see. When he finally stood and opened his eyes, the bush still burned, steady and constant. Moses picked up his sandals, but did not put them on immediately. His feet remained bare on the holy ground, feeling every stone, every grain of sand, as though the earth itself was different now, charged with meaning. He gathered his staff, called to his scattered sheep, but kept looking back at the flame, watching it burn in the gathering dusk. The walk back to camp felt longer than usual, or perhaps it was simply that Moses moved more slowly, his mind turning over everything he had heard, everything that had happened. The stars began to appear overhead, ancient lights in the darkness, and Moses thought about Abraham looking at these same stars generations ago, receiving promises that must have seemed just as impossible. The pattern repeated across time, the divine calling the unlikely, choosing the inadequate, working through weakness to display strength. When he reached the tent, Zipporah looked up from the fire she was tending, saw something in his face that made her rise quickly. Moses stood for a moment, trying to find words for what he had experienced, trying to explain how everything had changed in the space of an afternoon. The burning bush, the voice, the calling, the name. I am. How did you tell someone that you had stood on holy ground, that you had heard the divine speak, that your life of quiet hiding was over and an impossible journey was beginning? They talked long into the night, Moses speaking haltingly about the fire that did not consume, Zipporah asking questions, both of them trying to understand what this meant for their family, for their future, for the life they had built in this wilderness place. Moses could see the concern in her eyes, the fear of what he was being asked to do, but also something else, a recognition perhaps that this calling was real, that something had indeed happened on that mountain, something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. In the days that followed, Moses made preparations for the journey. He spoke with Jethro, his father-in-law, explaining as best he could why he needed to return to Egypt, why he had to leave the flocks and the safety of Midian behind. Jethro listened with the wisdom of age, heard what was said and what remained unspoken, and gave his blessing. Go in peace, he said, and Moses heard in those words both permission and prayer, a release and a benediction. The morning they left, Moses turned back one last time toward the mountain where the bush had burned. He could not see it from this distance, could not see the flame that had changed everything, but he carried the memory of it in his heart like a coal that would not go out. The voice from the fire had promised to be with him, and Moses clung to that promise as he set his face toward Egypt, toward a confrontation, toward a future he could not imagine but was learning to trust. The journey back was long and gave Moses much time to think, to doubt, to remember, to hope. Sometimes at night, when he closed his eyes, he could see the flame again, dancing before him in the darkness, burning steadily, never consuming. The image became a kind of prayer, a reminder that the divine presence was not dependent on place or circumstance, that what had begun at the burning bush continued now, invisible but real, a fire that travelled with him wherever he went. Aaron met them on the road, coming from Egypt as though drawn by the same divine hand that had spoken from the flame. The brothers embraced, and Moses shared everything, watching Aaron's face shift from skepticism to wonder as the story unfolded. The burning bush, the holy ground, the divine name, the impossible mission. Aaron listened and believed, and together they continued toward Egypt, two men carrying a message from a fire that would not die, bearing words from a presence that had identified itself only as I am. They gathered the elders first, the old men who remembered the promises made to their ancestors, who had kept faith alive through generations of oppression. Moses stood before them, feeling again all his old inadequacy, his lack of eloquence, his awareness that he was asking them to believe something extraordinary based on his word alone. But Aaron spoke for him, and Moses performed the signs he had been given, and slowly, gradually, belief kindled in their eyes like small flames, catching, spreading, growing. The people bowed their heads when they heard that the divine had seen their suffering, had heard their cries, had come down to deliver them. Tears flowed freely, generations of pain and hope mingling together. Moses watched and felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. These were the people he was meant to lead. These tired, oppressed, hoping against hope descendants of Abraham. The task seemed more impossible than ever, and yet the memory of the burning bush steadied him. "I will be with you," the voice had said. The flame had burned without consuming. Perhaps that same power would sustain them all through what was coming. The first meeting with Pharaoh went as badly as Moses had feared. The ruler of Egypt, comfortable in his power, amused by these Hebrew men who came with their strange demands and their invisible deity, dismissed them with contempt. Let the people go? Never. The result was predictable and painful. The burden on the Hebrew people increased, their work made harder, their suffering deepened. They turned on Moses with anger and despair, accusing him of making everything worse, of bringing down Pharaoh's wrath upon their heads. Moses cried out to the divine in his anguish, feeling the weight of failure crushing him. "Why did you send me? Why did you make promises you do not seem to keep? The people suffer more now than before. Pharaoh laughs at your name. Where is the deliverance you spoke of at the burning bush?" The questions poured out, raw and honest, the kind of prayers that come only from deep pain and deeper faith, faith that believes enough to bring its doubts directly to the source. The answer came not in rebuke but in reassurance, a reminder that what had been set in motion would not be stopped, that Pharaoh's resistance was expected, that deliverance would come but by a path Moses could not yet see. Trust the fire, trust the I am, trust the presence that does not fail even when all visible evidence suggests abandonment. What followed were signs and wonders that shook Egypt to its foundations, each one a demonstration of power, each one an invitation to release what could not be held, to let go of what was never truly possessed. Through it all, Moses returned again and again in his mind to the burning bush, to that moment when the flame had spoken his name, when the ground had become holy beneath his feet. That memory sustained him through Pharaoh's hardened refusals, through the people's complaints, through his own doubts and exhaustion. The bush had burned without being consumed, and somehow Moses understood that he too must burn, must pour himself out in service and obedience, trusting that the same power that had preserved those desert branches would preserve him as well. Finally, on a night heavy with grief and awe, the last barrier broke. Pharaoh, stripped of his pretensions, humbled by loss, gave the command. Go, take your people and go. Leave Egypt. Leave now, leave quickly before I change my mind. The Hebrew people gathered in haste, barely believing it was real, throwing together belongings and provisions, rousing children from sleep, moving in a chaos of hope and fear toward the freedom that had seemed impossible just hours before. Moses stood at the edge of the encampment as the people streamed past him, a river of humanity flowing toward an unknown future. Families carried their elderly, parents carried their young, everyone carried whatever they could salvage from their years of bondage. The night air was thick with voices, with prayers, with tears of relief and anticipation. Moses thought of the burning bush again, how this had all begun with a fire in the wilderness, a voice calling his name, an impossible commission accepted in trembling faith. They moved through the night and into the following days, a massive column of people and livestock, of carts and provisions, of hopes and fears all tangled together. The road ahead was uncertain, the destination unclear, but they were free, or beginning to be free, and that alone seemed miraculous enough. Moses walked among them, answered their questions when he could, admitted his ignorance when he could not, and kept his eyes lifted toward the horizon, watching for whatever sign would come next. The wilderness stretched before them, vast and forbidding. Many of the people had never left Egypt, had known only the narrow world of their oppression. Now they faced an openness that was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. The land offered no easy paths, no obvious direction, no guarantees of water or food or safety. They were utterly dependent, utterly vulnerable, a mass of humanity cast out into the unknown with nothing but a promise and a hope to guide them. As the first day of travel drew toward evening, a murmur went through the crowd, people pointing toward the sky ahead of them. Moses looked up and felt his breath catch in his throat. A great cloud had formed, thick and luminous, rising like a pillar before them. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though leading the way, and the people instinctively followed its movement. The cloud drew them forward, giving them direction, giving them something visible to follow in the vastness of the wilderness. When night fell, the cloud transformed. What had been white and billowing in the daylight became a pillar of fire in the darkness, a great column of flame that reached from earth to sky, burning steadily, impossibly, beautifully. The people stopped and stared, voices falling silent in wonder. Moses stood before the fiery pillar and felt tears streaming down his face. The burning bush had prepared him for this, had shown him that the divine presence often manifested as flame. That fire was somehow the appropriate symbol for the eternal, the holy, the utterly other that had chosen to make itself visible to human eyes. The pillar of fire illuminated the camp with a warm, steady glow. Children who had been frightened by the darkness now played in its light. Adults who had been anxious about the unknown path ahead found comfort in its constant presence. The fire did not flicker or fade through the long hours of night. It simply burned, a beacon and a promise, a reminder that they were not alone in this wilderness, that the presence that had called them out of Egypt was leading them still. Moses walked through the camp that night, watching the firelight play across the faces of his people. He saw wonder there, and relief, and something like joy beginning to emerge from beneath the layers of trauma and fear. The pillar of fire had given them something they desperately needed, not just light for the darkness, but assurance of presence, proof that they were seen, known, guided, protected. The flame that had spoken from the desert bush now led them through the desert night, and the symbolism was not lost on Moses. The same God, the same presence, the same I am. In the days that followed, the pattern established itself. By day, the cloud moved before them, providing shade from the brutal sun, giving them direction in the featureless wilderness. By night, the fire burned bright and constant, turning their camp into a place of light surrounded by darkness, an island of presence in the vast emptiness. The people learned to watch for the cloud's movement, to pack up when it lifted, to make camp when it settled, to let their journey be dictated by this visible manifestation of divine guidance. There were moments of crisis, of course. Moments when the way seemed impossible, when water could not be found, when food ran short, when enemies appeared on the horizon. The people grumbled and complained, remembered Egypt with an increasingly selective memory, questioned whether freedom in the wilderness was really better than slavery with full bellies. Moses bore their complaints and brought them to the divine in prayer, and again provision came. Water from unlikely sources, bread from the sky, quail from the sea, each provision a small miracle, each one a reminder that the pillar of fire was not just light, but life. Moses often stood alone at night, apart from the camp, watching the fire burn against the stars. It never ceased to amaze him, this manifestation of presence. The flame was constant yet dynamic, unchanging in its essence, yet always moving, always alive. It was exactly like the divine itself, faithful and mysterious, near and beyond, intimate and wholly other. Sometimes Moses prayed, sometimes he simply watched, and often he remembered that first burning bush, that first flame that had refused to consume its fuel, that had spoken his name and changed his life forever. The people began to understand that the pillar was more than just a guide. It was a protection. When danger threatened, the fire moved between them and their enemies, a wall of flame that could not be crossed, a barrier that said clearly, "These people are mine. They are under my protection. You shall not harm them." When the way ahead seemed blocked, the cloud moved in ways that revealed paths previously hidden, that led them safely through terrain that should have been impassable. Aaron walked beside Moses one evening, both of them watching the fire burn against the darkening sky. They spoke of the burning bush, of how it had all begun, of how that single flame in the wilderness had led to this, to a whole nation being led by fire through the darkness. Aaron asked if Moses ever doubted whether the fire was real, whether the presence it represented was truly there. Moses was quiet for a long time before answering, his eyes never leaving the burning pillar. "Every day," he admitted, "every day I doubt, and every day the fire burns on, constant and sure, and my doubt burns away in its light." The journey through the wilderness was long, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The pillar of fire became as familiar as the sun and moon, a permanent feature of their landscape, the axis around which their entire existence revolved. Children who had been born in Egypt grew into young adults who had known nothing but this wilderness life, this constant following of cloud and fire, this daily dependence on divine provision. Yet familiarity bred not contempt, but a deeper kind of trust. The people learned to read the fire's movements, to understand its rhythms, to find comfort in its constancy. When storms swept through the wilderness, the fire burned undimmed. When cold nights descended, its warmth reached farther than natural fire should. When fears crept in with the darkness, the light pushed them back, creating a circle of safety within which the people could rest. The pillar of fire was teacher and protector, guide and companion, a visible reminder that the invisible God had not abandoned them to the wilderness. Moses watched the people change over time, watched them transform from slaves into something else, something new. The wilderness was harsh, but it was also purifying, burning away the old identities, the old fears, the old limitations. Like the burning bush that was not consumed, the people were being refined by their journey, shaped by hardship into a nation that could bear the weight of covenant and calling. The fire that led them was also forming them, and Moses understood that the destination was not just a place, but a people, not just a land, but a community forged in the wilderness under the light of divine presence. There were nights when Moses could not sleep, when the weight of leadership pressed too heavily, when he felt the inadequacy that had haunted him since the burning bush. On those nights he would rise and walk to the edge of the camp, to where the pillar of fire burned brightest. He would stand in its light and remember the voice from the flame, the promises that had been made, the assurance that he would not be alone. The fire never spoke in words anymore, but its constancy was its own language, its steady burning a kind of conversation that said without saying, "I am here, I am with you, I will not fail you." Sometimes other people would join him there, drawn by sleeplessness or worry, or simply the desire to be near the fire. They would stand together in silence, watching the flames dance and shift, finding in their movement a kind of peace that words could not provide. The fire belonged to all of them, was given for all of them, and yet each person seemed to find in it something personal, something meant specifically for their own heart. One woman saw in it the hope of home, a man saw the promise of purpose, a child saw simply beauty and wonder, and all of them were right, all of them were seen. The years passed in this way, marked not by calendars, but by the movement of the pillar, by the rhythm of cloud and fire, by the daily miracles of provision and protection. The people grew strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical power, developed a kind of resilience that came from learning to trust what they could not control, to follow where they could not see the end, to believe in promises that seemed to delay but never disappear. The wilderness was their schoolroom, and the pillar of fire was both teacher and textbook, its lessons written in flame and shadow, in light and darkness, in the dance between the visible and the invisible. Moses grew old in the wilderness, his beard turning white, his body becoming bent, but his eyes remained clear and bright, reflecting the fire that had guided him from the burning bush to this moment. He had learned things in these years that no palace education could have taught him, had discovered that leadership was less about strength than surrender, less about knowing the way than about following the one who did. The fire had taught him patience and trust, had shown him that divine timing was not human timing, that what seemed like delay was often preparation, that the wilderness was not punishment but transformation. As he stood before the pillar of fire on what would be one of his last nights in the wilderness, Moses felt a profound gratitude wash over him, for the burning bush that had called him, for the courage to answer, for every step of this impossible journey, for the failures and the victories, for the complaints and the celebrations, for the times of doubt and the times of faith, for all of it. The fire had been constant through it all, burning without consuming, giving without diminishing, present without explanation. It had asked nothing but trust, and had given everything in return. The pillar of fire would lead the people beyond where Moses could go, would guide them into the promised land under new leadership, would continue to burn as it had burned since that first night of freedom. The flame that had spoken from a desert bush, that had stood between them and their enemies, that had illuminated countless wilderness nights, that flame would not go out. It would burn on, constant and sure, a testament to the faithfulness of the I Am, who had promised to be with them always. And somewhere, on a mountain far from where the people camped, another fire was waiting. Another flame was preparing to burn, to speak, to reveal. The pattern would repeat because the divine nature did not change, because fire and light remained the chosen symbols of presence and power, because what had been true at the burning bush and true in the pillar would be true again and again wherever the holy met the human, wherever heaven touched earth. The years moved forward like a river flowing toward the sea, carrying the story onward, carrying the people through time and trial toward purposes they could only dimly perceive. Generations rose and fell, kingdoms came and went, but the memory of the fire remained, passed down in stories, preserved in prayers, kindled again in the hearts of those who sought the divine presence in their own wilderness places. Centuries after Moses stood before the burning bush, after the pillar of fire had led the people home, after the wilderness years had become legend, the land promised to Abraham's descendants had become a kingdom. Hills and valleys that had been empty were now filled with towns and farms, with olive groves and vineyards, with the ordinary rhythms of life that come when wandering settles into dwelling. The people had mostly forgotten what it meant to follow a pillar of fire, to depend daily on divine provision, to live always ready to move at a moment's notice. The kingdom had grown comfortable, had made accommodations with the surrounding nations, had allowed other voices, other stories, other fires to burn alongside the memory of the I Am. Altars had been built to gods who promised easy fertility, simple prosperity, power without surrender. The exclusive claim of the burning bush, the singular flame that had led through the wilderness, had been diluted, made polite, domesticated into something that could coexist peacefully with whatever else people chose to believe or follow. Into this time of spiritual confusion came a prophet named Elijah, a man who moved like a storm across the landscape, whose words carried the weight of ancient authority, who seemed to burn with an inner fire that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable. He appeared suddenly in the court of King Ahab, delivered a message of coming drought, and then disappeared again into the wilderness, leaving behind fear and fury in equal measure. The king's wife Jezebel, who had worked tirelessly to replace the worship of the I Am with devotion to her own gods, marked Elijah for death. The drought came as predicted, and the land began to suffer. Month after month passed without rain, the sky remaining stubbornly blue, the earth cracking and drying, streams becoming trickles, becoming dust. Crops failed, livestock died, and the people cried out to their various gods for relief, for water, for mercy. But the heavens remained closed, sealed by a word spoken in the throne room, a word from a prophet who had vanished into the wilderness like smoke. Elijah spent those years hidden, first by a brook that eventually dried up, then in the home of a widow whose provisions miraculously never failed despite the famine spreading across the land. He learned patience in those hidden years, learned to trust provision that came in unexpected ways, learned that divine purposes often worked through waiting, through silence, through the slow work of preparation that happened out of sight. The fire that burned in him was being refined, tempered, made ready for what was coming. After 3 years of drought, the word came, "Go, show yourself to Ahab. Tell him that rain is coming." But first there would be a test, a demonstration, a moment of clarity that would cut through all the confusion and compromise. Elijah emerged from hiding like a prophet from an earlier age, like Moses descending from the mountain, carrying authority that needed no announcement, bearing truth that could not be ignored. He stood before King Ahab and issued a challenge that was both simple and impossibly bold. Gather all the people to Mount Carmel. Bring the prophets of Baal, the ones your wife has elevated and supported. Bring everyone who has been serving 2 masters, trying to honor both the I Am and the easier gods, trying to have it both ways. We will settle this question once and for all. We will see whose God answers, whose God is real, whose fire burns with true power. Mount Carmel rose against the sky, a sacred height that had witnessed countless prayers and sacrifices over the generations. Now it would witness something else, a confrontation between competing claims, a test that would strip away all ambiguity and force a choice. The people gathered slowly, climbing the slopes, filling the spaces between rocks and trees, curiosity and apprehension mingling on their faces. They had lived so long in the middle ground, trying to honour old promises while embracing new conveniences, and now they were being asked to choose. Elijah stood alone on one side, a single man representing the ancient covenant, the burning bush, the pillar of fire, the I Am who had called a people out of slavery and through the wilderness. On the other side stood 450 prophets of Baal, confident in their numbers, secure in their royal patronage, certain that their God who promised fertility and prosperity would demonstrate his power before this crowd. The contrast was stark and intentional, one against many, the old way against the new, the fire that had led Moses against the fires that promised easier paths. The prophet's voice rang out across the mountain, clear and strong, carrying to every person gathered there. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The people remained silent, unable or unwilling to answer, caught in the paralysis of wanting both, of trying to hedge their spiritual bets, of hoping they would never be forced to choose. But the time for choosing had come, and Elijah was not going to let them avoid it any longer. The terms of the test were simple. 2 bulls would be prepared for sacrifice, laid on wood, but no fire would be lit beneath them. The prophets of Baal would call on their God, and Elijah would call on the I Am, and the God who answered with fire would be acknowledged as the true God. The people murmured their agreement. It seemed fair, straightforward, a test that would provide clear results. Either fire would fall, or it would not. Either their God would answer, or he would remain silent. The prophets of Baal went first, choosing their bull, preparing their altar, laying the wood and the sacrifice with practiced precision. Then they began to call on their God, dancing around the altar, chanting prayers that grew louder and more desperate as the morning wore on. They called from dawn until noon, their voices echoing off the rocks, their movements becoming more frantic. But there was no response, no voice, no fire, nothing but the empty sky and the watching crowd and the silent altar. Elijah watched them with a kind of sad irony, even mocking them gently as the hours passed. "Call louder," he suggested. "Perhaps your God is sleeping, or busy, or travelling. Perhaps he cannot hear you." The prophets redoubled their efforts, cutting themselves in their desperation, mixing blood with their prayers, doing everything they could to provoke a response. But the altar remained cold, the wood unlit, the sacrifice untouched. The sky offered no answer to their cries. As the afternoon began to wane, their voices grew hoarse and their movements slowed. Exhaustion and failure settled over them like a shroud. They had done everything they knew to do, had called on their God with every technique and ritual at their disposal, and had received nothing in return. The silence was deafening, the absence overwhelming. The people watching began to shift uncomfortably, began to wonder what they had been following, what they had been trusting. Then Elijah stepped forward, and the mountain grew quiet. He moved deliberately, methodically, doing something that seemed to make no sense. He took 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and rebuilt an old altar that had fallen into disrepair, an altar dedicated to the I Am. He dug a trench around it, arranged the wood carefully, prepared the sacrifice, and laid it on top. The people watched, wondering what he was doing, why he was being so careful, so precise, when the prophets of Baal had failed despite all their energy and passion. Then Elijah did something that seemed like madness. He called for water, precious water in this land that had seen no rain for 3 years, and he poured it over the sacrifice, over the wood, over everything. Once, twice, 3 times, until the altar was soaked, until water filled the trench around it, until there was no possibility that any natural fire could catch on that drenched wood. The people gasped, confused by this apparent sabotage of his own test. What was he doing? Why was he making it impossible for fire to burn? But Elijah knew what Moses had known before him, what every person who had encountered the divine fire had learned. This was not about human effort or technique or creating the right conditions. This was about divine power that needed no help, that worked precisely when and where natural means failed, that demonstrated its reality by doing what was impossible. The soaked altar was not a problem to be overcome, but a stage being set, a canvas being prepared for a display of glory that would leave no room for doubt or confusion. The prophet stood before the altar, his arms raised toward heaven, and began to pray. His voice was not loud or frantic like the prophets of Baal had been. It was steady, confident, intimate, the voice of someone addressing a presence he knew was listening, a God he trusted would answer. He prayed to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, invoking the ancient covenant, the old promises, the faithfulness that had been demonstrated from the burning bush through the wilderness and into this land. He asked that the people would know, would understand, would see clearly that the Lord alone was God. The prayer was simple and short, nothing like the hours of desperate calling that had preceded it. Elijah spoke as Moses had spoken before the burning bush, as someone who knew he stood on holy ground, as someone who understood that the fire he was calling down was not earned or manipulated, but given, freely offered by a God who chose to manifest his presence in flame and light. Then he stepped back, his prayer complete, and waited. For a moment nothing happened. The mountain was silent, the people holding their breath, the altar sitting wet and cold under the afternoon sky. Then suddenly, without warning or build-up, fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame, not a spark that slowly caught, but an explosion of divine fire that consumed everything instantly. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the very dust, the water in the trench, all of it disappeared in a roaring conflagration that burned with an intensity beyond anything natural, beyond anything human eyes had seen since the pillar of fire had led their ancestors through the wilderness. The people fell on their faces, crying out in awe and terror and recognition. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The words burst from them involuntarily, forced out by the sheer power of what they had witnessed, by the undeniable reality of divine presence made visible. The fire had spoken more clearly than any words could, had answered the question that had hung over the mountain all day. This was the true God, the I Am who had called Moses, who had led Israel, who could send fire from heaven to consume not just a sacrifice, but every doubt, every compromise, every attempt to serve two masters. Elijah stood in the glow of the divine fire, his face lit by its flames, and felt something that Moses must have felt before the burning bush, that the people must have felt under the pillar of fire. This was presence. This was power. This was the reality behind all the stories and promises and covenants. The fire burned away pretense and confusion, left only truth standing bare and undeniable. The God who had spoken from flame in the wilderness spoke through flame again on this mountain, and the message was the same. I am here, I am real, I alone am God. The prophets of Baal, their failure complete and devastating, were taken away. The people, their hearts turned back to the ancient covenant, began to remember what they had forgotten, to reclaim what they had set aside. The sky, closed for 3 years by the word of a prophet, began to gather clouds. Elijah climbed to the peak of Carmel and prayed again, this time for rain, for the blessing that would follow the judgment, for the restoration that would come after the purging fire. The servant who climbed with him kept watch toward the sea, looking for any sign of the promised rain. 6 times he looked and saw nothing but clear sky. But on the 7th time he saw a small cloud rising from the sea, no bigger than a hand, but growing, spreading, darkening as it came. Elijah knew what it meant. The drought was breaking, the rain was coming, the land would be renewed. The fire from heaven had accomplished its work, had turned hearts and proved truth, and now the water would come to heal and restore what the years of judgment had dried and broken. The rain came in a torrent, sheets of water pouring from the sky, as though the heavens had been storing it up for precisely this moment. The people lifted their faces to it, let it wash over them, mingled their tears with the rain. The land drank deeply, gratefully, and everywhere there was a sense of new beginning, of restoration, of a covenant renewed. The fire had prepared the way, and the water was sealing what the fire had begun. But Elijah, standing in the rain, knew that fire and faith were always more complicated than a single moment of glory. The demonstration on Mount Carmel had been dramatic and decisive, but human hearts were fickle, and the forces opposed to the ancient covenant were not so easily defeated. The rain fell, the land was renewed, but the prophet understood that the work of maintaining faith, of keeping the fire burning in people's hearts, was a daily task that never ended, a calling that demanded everything and promised only the presence of the one who called. The pattern continued through generations, the divine presence manifesting again and again in fire and light, calling people back when they wandered, demonstrating power when faith faltered, burning away the accumulation of compromise and confusion. Prophets arose and spoke words that burned like coals, that set hearts aflame with conviction or anger, that refused to let the people settle into comfortable forgetfulness. The fire on Carmel became a memory, a story told and retold, a reminder that the I Am still answered, still cared, still worked in visible ways when the need was great enough. Centuries passed, and the people's circumstances changed dramatically. The kingdom divided, then fell. Foreign powers conquered, destroyed, scattered. The temple that had been built to house the divine presence was reduced to ruins. The people were carried away into exile, into strange lands where they were minorities, strangers, refugees clinging to memories of a homeland they might never see again. The fire seemed distant now, the burning bush and the pillar, and Mount Carmel all belonging to a past that felt increasingly like legend rather than history. Yet even in exile the fire was not forgotten. The stories were preserved, passed down, adapted, kept alive by people who refused to let their identity be erased by distance or time or suffering. They remembered the God of fire and light, remembered the covenant made in the wilderness, remembered that they belonged to something larger and older than any empire that had conquered them. The fire burned in memory, in hope, in the stubborn persistence of faith that refused to be extinguished. Eventually, some returned to the land, rebuilt what had been destroyed, tried to reclaim what had been lost. The temple rose again, smaller and less grand than before, but still a place where the divine presence could be sought, where prayers could be offered, where the ancient rhythms of worship could be maintained. Yet something felt different, distant, as though the fire that had once burned so visibly had withdrawn, become hidden, expressed itself more subtly and less dramatically than in the days of Moses and Elijah. The people waited, living in the tension between memory and hope, between what had been and what might yet be. They kept the law, observed the festivals, told the old stories and wondered when the fire would return, when the presence would manifest again in ways that could not be denied or doubted. The prophets had promised a future restoration, a coming day when everything would be renewed, when the divine presence would return not just to a temple but to the whole earth, when fire and light would illuminate darkness and bring life from death. Generations came and went, empires rose and fell, and still the people waited. The land changed hands multiple times, each conqueror bringing new challenges, new compromises, new reasons to wonder if the old promises still held. Some kept faith vigorously, maintaining every detail of tradition and law. Others accommodated, adapted, found ways to survive in a world that seemed to have little room for the fierce devotion demanded by the god of the burning bush. And many simply lived in the middle, trying to honour their heritage while navigating the practical demands of daily existence under foreign rule. Into this world of waiting and wondering, a new chapter began in the city of Jerusalem. The Roman Empire now controlled the land, and the people lived under the weight of occupation, paying taxes to foreign powers, watching their customs and traditions erode under the pressure of imperial culture. The temple still stood, sacrifices were still offered, prayers were still lifted, but for many it felt like going through motions, maintaining forms whose power and meaning had faded with time. In an upper room in Jerusalem, a small group gathered in the days following events that had shaken them to their cores. They were followers of a teacher who had been executed, a rabbi who had claimed extraordinary things, performed remarkable acts, and then been killed in the manner reserved for rebels and criminals. For 3 years they had followed him, believed in him, hoped that he might be the one to restore everything that had been lost, to bring back the fire and glory that their ancestors had known. His death had shattered those hopes, or seemed to, but then something impossible had happened. He had appeared to them, alive, transformed, bearing wounds that should have been fatal, but speaking words of peace and promise. For 40 days he had taught them, prepared them, told them about a gift that was coming, a power that would be given, a presence that would dwell not in a temple made of stone, but in hearts made ready by faith. Then he had departed, ascending in a way that defied natural explanation, leaving them with a promise and an instruction. Wait in Jerusalem, pray, prepare. Something is coming. So they waited, gathering daily in that upper room, a community of about 120 people who had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but trust that the promise would be fulfilled. They prayed together, remembered together, supported one another through the uncertainty and the grief and the strange fragile hope that refused to die despite everything that had happened. Days passed in this way, each one feeling longer than the last, each one requiring renewed faith that the waiting was not in vain. Mary, the mother of their teacher, was among them, her face bearing the marks of profound sorrow and deeper faith. She had seen and heard and experienced things that no one else could fully understand, had carried within her body the mystery of divine and human meeting, had watched her son die, and then encountered him alive again. She prayed with the others, quiet and steady, an anchor for those whose faith was newer and more fragile. Her presence reminded them that waiting was sacred work, that patience was its own kind of strength, that God's timing was not bound by human expectations. The men who had walked most closely with their teacher, who were now being called apostles, bore the weight of leadership uneasily. Peter, who had denied knowing the teacher in his darkest hour and had been restored by forgiveness, prayed with an intensity born of gratitude and determination. John, the youngest, who had stood at the foot of the cross when others had fled, prayed with the depth of love that had sustained him through horror. James and Andrew and the others, each carrying their own mixture of memory and hope, added their voices to the chorus of prayer that filled the upper room day after day. On the 50th day after Passover, the day of the festival called Pentecost, when Jews from many nations gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the harvest and remember the giving of the law at Sinai, the believers were together in that upper room as they had been every day since they had begun this vigil of waiting. The morning had dawned clear and warm, the city below them filling with pilgrims and merchants, the sounds of many languages drifting up through the windows. It seemed like any other day of prayer and waiting, another increment of time to be endured with patience. Then suddenly everything changed. A sound came from heaven, rushing and powerful, like a violent wind filling the entire house where they were gathered. It was not wind exactly, or not only wind, but something that carried the force and movement of wind while being somehow more, something that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that penetrated walls and hearts with equal ease. The sound was loud enough to be heard beyond the room, drawing attention from the streets below, marking this moment as different from all the quiet days that had preceded it. The believers looked at one another in wonder and something close to fear, recognizing that what they had been waiting for was beginning to happen, that the promise was being fulfilled in ways they had not imagined. The sound continued, not fading but building, and with it came a presence that filled the space, that pressed in on them from all sides, that was somehow both outside them and beginning to move within them. They had prayed for this, had waited for this, but the reality of it was more overwhelming than any anticipation could have prepared them for. Then they saw the fire. Tongues of flame appeared, hovering in the air above them, dividing and moving, until one rested above each person in that room. The fire was visible to all of them, bright and clear, but it did not burn. Like the bush that Moses had seen in the wilderness, like the pillar that had led Israel through the darkness, this fire burned without consuming, gave light without destroying. Each person felt the warmth of it, the weight of it settling on them like a mantle, like a crown, like a blessing that carried both gift and responsibility. The flames were beautiful, dancing gently above each head, distinct yet somehow connected, individual expressions of a single source. Mary watched a tongue of fire settle on Peter, on John, on all the others, and felt one rest on herself as well. The fire was not frightening, though it should have been. Instead, it felt like recognition, like being seen and known and chosen, like the presence they had been seeking had found them at last. This was what their teacher had promised, the gift he had told them to wait for, the power from on high that would transform them from confused followers into bold witnesses. As the fire rested on them, something shifted inside each person. Peter felt words rising in his throat, words in languages he had never learned, phrases and sentences flowing out with perfect fluency in tongues he had never studied. Around him, others were experiencing the same thing, speaking in Parthian and Median and Elamite, in languages from all across the known world. The sound of it filled the room, a chorus of praise and proclamation in a dozen different tongues, each person speaking what the Spirit gave them to say. The noise drew a crowd from the streets below, people who had heard the sound like wind, who were curious or concerned about what was happening in that upper room. When the believers came out, still speaking in these various languages, still bearing the invisible fire that had descended on them, the crowd pressed closer, listening in amazement. Parthians heard their language spoken by Galileans who should not have known it. Egyptians heard their tongue, Libyans heard theirs. Visitors from Rome heard Latin flowing from mouths that had never been to Rome. Each person in that diverse crowd heard the wonders of God declared in their own native language, and the impossibility of it left them stunned. Some were amazed and asked earnestly what this meant, what was happening, how these unlearned people could speak in so many languages with such fluency. Others, uncomfortable with what they could not explain, mocked and suggested that the speakers must be drunk, that this was nothing more than the babbling of people who had started celebrating the festival too enthusiastically too early in the day. The miracle that was obvious to some was dismissed by others, the same pattern that had played out before burning bushes and pillars of fire throughout history. Peter, emboldened by the fire that had descended on him, stood up before the crowd and began to speak. His voice carried with an authority that had not been there before, a confidence born not of his own strength, but of the presence that now filled him. He addressed the mockery first, pointed out that it was only 9 a.m, far too early for drunkenness to be a reasonable explanation. Then he began to explain what was really happening, connecting this moment to ancient prophecies, to promises made generations ago about a time when the Spirit would be poured out on all people. He spoke about the teacher they had followed, about the miracles and signs that had accompanied his ministry, about his death and resurrection. The words poured out of Peter with a fluency and boldness that amazed even those who knew him well. This was the man who had denied knowing his teacher just weeks ago, who had hidden in fear, who had seemed broken by failure. Now he stood before thousands, proclaiming truth with courage and clarity, and the fire that rested invisibly on his head was burning away the old fears, the old inadequacies, the old self that had been defined by weakness. The crowd listened, some with growing conviction, others with hardening resistance. Peter's words cut to the heart, exposing truth that was both liberating and demanding. He called them to respond, to turn from their old ways, to embrace the new thing that was beginning in their midst. The fire of Pentecost was not just for the believers in the upper room. It was the beginning of a larger burning, a flame that would spread from person to person, from city to city, from generation to generation, never consuming, but always transforming, always giving light in darkness. 3,000 people responded that day, accepting the message, choosing to join this community that had been marked by fire and filled with the Spirit. They were baptized, initiated into a new way of living, a new understanding of what it meant to be the people of God. The fire that had descended on 120 now spread to thousands, an invisible but real presence that was transforming hearts and minds, creating a community bound not by ethnicity or geography, but by shared experience of divine fire. The days that followed were marked by a kind of sustained burning, a continuous experience of the Spirit's presence and power among the believers. They gathered daily, shared meals and possessions, prayed and studied together, and found themselves living in a reality where the boundary between heaven and earth seemed thinner than it had ever been. Signs and wonders happened regularly, not spectacular displays meant to impress, but organic expressions of divine presence at work through human vessels. The fire on their heads was no longer visible, but its effects remained clear. People spoke with boldness about things they had witnessed, healed the sick in the name of their risen teacher, lived with a generosity and joy that attracted others, even as it threatened the established order. The religious authorities, who had thought they had ended a troublesome movement with an execution, now found it growing rapidly, spreading through Jerusalem like wildfire, impossible to contain or control. Peter and John, walking to the temple one afternoon, encountered a man who had been lame from birth, a beggar who sat at the gate called Beautiful, asking for alms. Peter looked at him with eyes that had been changed by fire, seeing not just a problem or a charity case, but a person, a human being made in the divine image, someone whom the Spirit was prompting him to address. "Silver and gold I do not have," Peter said, "but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." The man leaped up, his legs suddenly strong, his body suddenly capable of what it had never done before. He walked and jumped and praised God, his joy overflowing, his healing complete and immediate. The people who saw it were amazed, gathering around, asking how this had happened. Peter, standing in the temple courts with the healed man beside him, seized the opportunity to explain again about the teacher, about the resurrection, about the fire that had fallen at Pentecost and was now working through those who believed. The religious authorities arrested them, disturbed by this teaching, threatened by this power that operated outside their control. But Peter, filled with the Spirit, spoke before the council with the same boldness he had shown at Pentecost. The fire that had descended on him was not just for that one dramatic day, but for every day that followed, a constant source of courage and clarity, enabling him to speak truth even when threatened, even when the cost might be high. The council, seeing the healed man standing there as living proof, could not deny what had happened, but commanded Peter and John to stop teaching in that name. Peter's response was simple and direct. Whether it is right to obey you rather than God, you must judge. But we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. The fire had made him bold, had transformed him from a man who denied knowing his teacher to save his own skin into a man who could not be silenced by threats. The change was absolute, the transformation complete, and it came not from human effort or willpower, but from the presence of the Spirit that burned within like an eternal flame. The community grew despite opposition, or perhaps because of it. The fire that had fallen at Pentecost continued to spread, person to person, heart to heart, creating a movement that could not be stopped by arrests or threats or even martyrdom. When persecution intensified and scattered the believers beyond Jerusalem, they carried the fire with them, proclaiming the message wherever they went, establishing new communities, seeing the same Spirit work in new places and new people. Stephen, a man described as full of faith and of the Spirit, performed great wonders among the people and spoke with a wisdom that his opponents could not resist. When they could not defeat his arguments, they arrested him on false charges and brought him before the council. Stephen stood before his accusers with a face that shone like an angel, and he spoke about the long history of the people, about how they had always resisted the Spirit, about how the patterns of the past were being repeated in the present. His words angered the council, but Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God, saw the risen Christ standing at the right hand of the throne. He described what he saw, and this claim was too much for those who heard it. They rushed at him, dragged him outside the city, and began to stone him. As the rocks fell and his life ebbed away, Stephen prayed, asking that this sin not be held against his attackers, echoing the words his teacher had spoken from the cross. He died as he had lived, filled with the Spirit, bearing witness even at the moment of death, the fire within him unquenched by violence. Among those who approved of Stephen's execution was a young man named Saul, a zealous defender of tradition, a persecutor of this new movement that he saw as heresy and threat. He watched Stephen die with satisfaction, believing he was defending the faith of his fathers, protecting the purity of his people from corruption and error. The fire that burned in the believers looked to him like dangerous delusion, something that needed to be stamped out before it spread further. Saul obtained letters of authority and set out for Damascus, planning to arrest any followers of this movement he could find there and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. He travelled with single-minded determination, convinced of the righteousness of his cause, certain that he was serving God by opposing these people who claimed impossible things about a crucified criminal. The road stretched ahead of him under the bright sun, and he moved along it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Then at midday, when the sun was at its brightest, a light from heaven flashed around him, a light brighter than the sun, more intense than anything natural. Saul fell to the ground, blinded and terrified, hearing a voice that seemed to come from the light itself, a voice that asked a question that would change everything. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" The pattern repeated again, the divine presence manifesting in light, calling a name twice, initiating a transformation that would ripple through history. The voice identified itself as the one Saul was persecuting, the risen teacher whose followers Saul had been hunting. The encounter was brief but total, a moment of revelation that shattered every certainty Saul had built his life upon. He rose from the ground unable to see, led by hand into Damascus, and spent 3 days in darkness, fasting and praying, his entire understanding of reality being rebuilt from the ground up. The light that had blinded him physically was illuminating him spiritually, burning away the old Saul and beginning to forge someone new. A believer named Ananias received a vision directing him to go to Saul, to lay hands on him, to restore his sight, and welcome him into the community he had been persecuting. Ananias was understandably hesitant, having heard of Saul's reputation, knowing the danger he represented. But the vision was clear, the command direct, and Ananias went in obedience, trusting that the one who had manifested in light to Saul knew what he was doing. He found Saul blind and broken, laid hands on him, spoke words of welcome and commission, and scales fell from Saul's eyes. He could see again, but more importantly, he could see truly for the first time. The man who emerged from that Damascus house was not the same man who had entered it. Saul, who would come to be known as Paul, began immediately to proclaim in the synagogues that the teacher he had persecuted was indeed the promised one, was the fulfillment of everything the scriptures had been pointing toward. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it confused everyone. His former allies thought he had lost his mind or been deceived. The believers were suspicious, remembering his violence, doubting the genuineness of his conversion. But Paul persisted, driven by the same fire that had descended at Pentecost, carrying the same spirit that had emboldened Peter and sustained Stephen. Paul would spend the rest of his life travelling throughout the known world, establishing communities of believers, writing letters that would shape the faith for centuries to come, enduring hardships and persecutions that would have broken most people. The light that had struck him on the Damascus road remained with him, an inner fire that sustained him through shipwrecks and beatings, through imprisonment and rejection, through every circumstance that would have been easier to escape than to endure. He carried the fire wherever he went, and it spread from city to city, from heart to heart, creating a network of communities bound together by shared experience of the Spirit's presence and power. The pattern of fire and light continued, weaving through the early years of this movement that was beginning to be called Christianity. The Spirit worked visibly, dramatically, undeniably, giving gifts and power to people who proclaimed the message of the risen teacher. The fire that had fallen at Pentecost was not a one-time event, but the beginning of a new era, a permanent change in how the divine presence manifested among people. The temple in Jerusalem still stood, Sacrifices were still offered, but the true dwelling place of the divine was no longer a building, but the hearts of those who believed, who had been marked by fire and filled with the Spirit. Years passed, and the movement spread beyond its Jewish origins, crossing cultural and ethnic boundaries that had seemed impermeable. The fire burned in Gentiles as it had in Jews, proving that the Spirit was not limited by human categories or traditions. Peter, who had once been shocked by this universality, came to embrace it, understanding that the God who had called Moses from a burning bush, who had led Israel with a pillar of fire, who had answered Elijah on Mount Carmel, was the same God who was now pouring out the Spirit on all people without distinction. Yet even as the fire spread, even as the movement grew and transformed lives and communities, there remained a hunger for something more, a sense that what had been revealed was glorious but not yet complete. The believers knew their risen teacher had ascended, had promised to return, had told them that greater things were still to come. They lived in the tension of already and not yet, experiencing the reality of the Spirit's presence while longing for the fullness of the kingdom that had been promised. The fire burned in them, but they sensed it was only a foretaste, a preview of a greater burning yet to come. In those early years, before the movement became established, before it was recognized as a distinct religion, before the structures and hierarchies and theological systems developed, there was a rawness to the experience of faith that would later be remembered with a mixture of nostalgia and reverence. The fire burned more visibly then, or so it seemed in retrospect, though perhaps it was simply that people were more aware of it, more attentive to the presence that was transforming them from the inside out. One of those who carried the fire most intensely was John, the disciple who had stood at the cross, who had been there in the upper room at Pentecost, who had walked and talked with their teacher through 3 years of ministry. John lived long, outlasting the other apostles, carrying the memory of everything he had witnessed deep into old age. He saw Jerusalem destroyed, saw the temple torn down, saw the movement he had been part of at its beginning spread throughout the Roman world and beyond. In his later years, John was exiled to an island called Patmos, a rocky, isolated place where Rome sent those it considered dangerous but not worth executing. There, alone with his memories and his faith, John experienced visions that would shape the imagination of believers for millennia to come. He saw the risen Christ in glory, blazing with a light that made the sun seem dim, and he wrote down what he saw in language that burned with the intensity of his vision. The fire that had descended at Pentecost, that had marked his life since that day, blazed up in these visions with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. But the story of fire and light had begun before Pentecost, before Paul's Damascus Road experience, before Stephen's martyrdom. It had begun with the teacher himself, with the one whose death and resurrection had made all these other things possible. And in his life, there had been a moment when fire and light had blazed forth in a way that previewed everything to come, that revealed something essential about identity and glory and divine purpose. It happened on a mountain, as these revelatory moments so often did. Mountains seemed to be thin places where heaven and earth drew close, where the divine presence could manifest more clearly, where people could encounter truth that was difficult to perceive in the valleys below. Moses had encountered the burning bush on a mountain, had received the law on another mountain. Elijah had called down fire on Mount Carmel, and now, perhaps 6 months before his death, the teacher took 3 of his closest disciples up a high mountain to pray. Peter, James, and John climbed with their teacher in the late afternoon, their legs burning with the effort, their breath coming hard in the thin air. They did not know why they were going, what they would see, What would happen? Their teacher often withdrew to pray, seeking solitude and silence, and sometimes he took them with him. They had learned not to ask too many questions, to simply follow where he led, trusting that there was purpose in everything he did, even when that purpose was not immediately apparent. As evening approached and the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the teacher moved a little apart from them to pray. The disciples, exhausted from the climb and the events of recent days, found comfortable places among the rocks and settled down to rest. Their eyes grew heavy, their bodies relaxed, and they drifted into that half-sleeping state where awareness dims but does not disappear entirely. The mountain was quiet except for the wind moving through the sparse vegetation, and the disciples let themselves rest in that peace. Then light began to bloom on the mountain, not the fading light of sunset, but something else, something that was originating from the teacher himself. Peter stirred, his eyes opening, and what he saw shocked him into full wakefulness. The teacher was changing before their eyes, his face beginning to shine like the sun, his clothes becoming white as light, so bright that it hurt to look directly at him. This was not reflected light, not the sun catching on fabric, but light emanating from within, radiating outward with an intensity that transformed everything it touched. Peter grabbed James and John, shaking them fully awake, pointing at the transfigured teacher. All three disciples stared, barely breathing, witnessing something that seemed impossible, yet was undeniably real. The man they had followed for 3 years, who had walked dusty roads and eaten simple meals and shown every sign of ordinary humanity, was revealing something else, was displaying a glory that had been hidden beneath the veil of flesh. This was the divine breaking through, the eternal light that dwelt in him shining forth without restraint. The light was not harsh or painful, despite its intensity. It was pure and beautiful, the kind of light that seemed to illuminate not just surfaces, but essences, revealing truth rather than obscuring it. The disciples felt drawn to it, even as they felt the instinct to shield their eyes, wanting to look away from something too glorious to behold, yet unable to tear their gaze from the spectacle unfolding before them. This was holiness made visible, the presence of the divine in human form, and it was more wonderful and terrible than anything they had imagined. As they watched, transfixed, 2 figures appeared standing with their teacher in the light. The disciples somehow knew who these figures were, though they had never seen them, though they had died centuries before. Moses and Elijah, the great figures from their history, the ones who had encountered God on mountains, who had seen fire and glory, who represented the law and the prophets, the entire weight of their tradition and faith. They were speaking with the transfigured teacher, conversing about something the disciples could not quite hear, their presence affirming that what was happening on this mountain was connected to everything that had come before. Moses, who had seen the burning bush and led the people through the wilderness, stood in the light of transfiguration and recognized what he was seeing. This was the I Am made flesh, the presence that had spoken from flame now dwelling in human form, the glory that had filled the tabernacle now shining from a human face. Elijah, who had called down fire from heaven, who had encountered the divine in whisper and in wind, stood beside the one who embodied everything the fire had been pointing toward, who was himself the light that all other lights reflected. Peter, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing, felt compelled to say something, to do something, to somehow respond to this extraordinary moment. His words tumbled out, awkward and inadequate, an offer to build shelters for the 3 glorious figures, to somehow preserve this moment, to make it last. He did not know what he was saying, the text would later note, speaking simply from the overflow of wonder and fear, and the human desire to contain and control experiences that are too large, too significant, too transformative to simply receive and release. Before the teacher could respond to Peter's suggestion, before anything could be decided or done, a bright cloud appeared, enveloping them all, surrounding them with luminous presence. The cloud was bright, not dark, radiating light rather than blocking it, and the disciples recognized it immediately as the same kind of cloud that had led their ancestors through the wilderness, that had filled the temple when it was dedicated, that signified the divine presence dwelling among the people. This was the glory cloud, the Shekinah, and it was here, now, on this mountain, surrounding them with holiness. From within the cloud, a voice spoke, resonant and clear, carrying absolute authority. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The words echoed across the mountain, and the disciples fell on their faces, terrified and overcome. This was the voice that had spoken from the burning bush, that had given the law at Sinai, that had answered Elijah on Mount Carmel, and it was speaking now, declaring identity and issuing command. The transfigured teacher was confirmed as the Son, the beloved, the one to whom they must listen above all others. The disciples lay prostrate, trembling, unable to look up, overwhelmed by the weight of glory that pressed down on them. This was too much, too holy, too far beyond their capacity to comprehend or bear. They had followed their teacher thinking they understood who he was, what he was about, where he was leading them. But this revelation shattered all their categories, showed them that they had barely begun to grasp the reality of what they were part of, who they were following, what was truly at stake in everything that was happening. Then they felt a hand on their shoulders, gentle and familiar, and heard a voice they knew telling them not to be afraid, to get up, to look. They raised their heads slowly, cautiously, and saw their teacher standing before them alone. The light faded, the glory veiled once more behind ordinary human appearance. Moses and Elijah were gone. The cloud had lifted. The voice had fallen silent. It was just the four of them on the mountain in the gathering darkness, and the teacher was looking at them with compassion and understanding, knowing that they had seen something that would take years to fully process and integrate. As they began the descent from the mountain, walking carefully in the dim light, the teacher told them not to speak of what they had seen until after certain events had transpired, until after he had risen from the dead. The disciples did not understand what he meant by rising from the dead, were still trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed, but they kept silent as he had asked, holding the memory of the transfiguration close, turning it over in their minds, wondering what it meant and what it revealed. Peter would remember that mountain for the rest of his life, would write about it decades later, would speak of having been eyewitnesses of the teacher's majesty, of hearing the voice from heaven on the sacred mountain. That moment of transfiguration would sustain him through the dark days that followed, through the horror of crucifixion and the confusion before resurrection, through persecution and hardship, and the long years of ministry. When doubt crept in, when the way seemed unclear, when the cost of faith seemed too high, Peter would remember the mountain of light, would recall the glory that had blazed forth, would hear again the voice declaring identity and issuing command. James would carry the memory with him until his own martyrdom, becoming the first of the apostles to die for the faith he proclaimed. The light he had seen on the mountain illuminated his path through imprisonment and trial, gave him courage to face death with confidence, assured him that what awaited beyond was not darkness, but the fullness of the glory he had glimpsed on that sacred height. He died young, but he died having seen something that most people never see, having been given a preview of the truth that death could not diminish or destroy. John, who would outlive them all, would meditate on the Transfiguration for decades, would weave its themes through everything he wrote, would begin his account of the teacher's life with words about light and darkness, about the Word made flesh dwelling among them, full of grace and truth, revealing glory. The old man on Patmos, writing his visions of things to come, drew on memories of things past, connected the glory seen on the mountain to the glory yet to be revealed, understood that what had flashed forth briefly in Transfiguration would one day blaze forth permanently, transforming not just one person but all creation. The Transfiguration was a pivot point, a moment of revelation that looked backward and forward simultaneously. It connected to all the manifestations of divine fire and light that had come before: the burning bush, the pillar of fire, the flame on Mount Carmel, the glory cloud in the temple. It pointed forward to the fire that would descend at Pentecost, to the light that would strike Paul on the Damascus road, to the ultimate revelation when the teacher would return in glory and every eye would see him blazing with the light that had been briefly unveiled on the mountain. The disciples did not fully understand any of this on that night as they descended the mountain, their legs shaky, their minds reeling, their hearts full of wonder and confusion in equal measure. They simply walked in silence, following their teacher down into the valley where crowds and needs and the ordinary demands of ministry awaited. The glory was veiled again, hidden beneath the appearance of simple humanity, but they had seen what lay beneath, had glimpsed the truth of identity that would later be articulated in theological language, but was first experienced as pure light, as transformative fire, as the divine presence made visible to human eyes. In the months that followed, as the teacher moved steadily toward Jerusalem and the events that would culminate in crucifixion, the memory of the Transfiguration sustained the three who had witnessed it. They did not speak of it, keeping silent as they had been commanded, but it lived in them like a coal that could not be extinguished, like a flame that burned steadily even when circumstances seemed to contradict everything it had revealed. When the teacher spoke of suffering and death, when he predicted betrayal and abandonment, when the path ahead seemed to lead only to disaster, the disciples who had been on the mountain held tight to what they had seen, trusting that the glory they had witnessed was more real than the darkness that threatened. The Transfiguration was not the end of the story, but a glimpse of the end, a preview of the culmination, a moment when eternity broke into time and revealed what was true always and everywhere, even when hidden beneath the veil of ordinary appearance. The light that shone from the teacher's face on that mountain was the same light that had always dwelt in him, the eternal radiance of the divine made flesh, the glory of the only begotten from the Father. The Transfiguration did not create that glory but revealed it, pulled back the curtain for a moment, and let three witnesses see what was always there, what would one day be visible to all. The story of fire and light weaves through human history like a golden thread, appearing in different times and places, taking different forms but always pointing to the same reality. The burning bush that was not consumed, the pillar that led through darkness, the fire that fell on Mount Carmel, the tongues of flame at Pentecost, the light on the Damascus road, the Transfiguration on the mountain, all of these were manifestations of the same presence, the same God who chose to make himself known through fire and light, who used these elements to reveal truth and call forth faith and transform those who encountered them. There is a pattern to these encounters, a consistency that runs through the diversity of circumstances and times. The fire always comes as gift, never as something earned or manipulated. Moses did not create the burning bush, did not conjure the flame through ritual or technique. It simply appeared, burning steadily, waiting to be noticed. The pillar of fire was given to guide the people through the wilderness, not produced by their prayers or piety, but offered freely as grace, as divine initiative reaching down to meet human need. Elijah did not generate the fire on Mount Carmel through his own power, but called on the God who answers, who chooses to manifest in flame when and where it serves his purposes. The fire reveals presence. It is not an abstract symbol or a metaphor, but a genuine manifestation of the divine being among people. When Moses asked for a name at the burning bush, the answer was, I am, existence itself, pure being, and the fire was the visible form of that invisible reality. The pillar of fire that led Israel through the wilderness was not just showing them the way, but demonstrating that they were not alone, that the one who had called them out of Egypt was with them in their wandering, sharing their journey, guiding their steps. The tongues of flame at Pentecost were not mere visual effects, but the presence of the Spirit taking up residence in human hearts, indwelling and empowering and transforming from within. The fire purifies without destroying. The burning bush was not consumed, its branches remaining green and alive even as flames danced through them. This paradox speaks to the nature of divine fire, which burns away what is false and temporary, without annihilating what is true and eternal. Moses was not destroyed by his encounter with the burning bush, but transformed. His doubts and inadequacies gradually burned away, his true calling revealed and empowered. The fire that descended at Pentecost did not harm those it touched, but filled them, burned away fear and confusion, left them bold and clear, and empowered to speak truth with authority. The fire guides and directs. The pillar of fire gave the Israelites clear direction in the featureless wilderness, moving when they should move, stopping when they should stop, providing a visible focal point for a community that might otherwise have fragmented and wandered aimlessly. The fire showed them not just the destination, but the next step, taught them to live in daily dependence, to trust guidance that came incrementally rather than revealing the entire journey at once. This pattern continues in every generation, the fire of the Spirit directing those who are willing to follow, illuminating the path one step at a time, requiring trust more than certainty. The fire empowers for mission. Moses received his calling from the burning bush and was sent to do something that seemed impossible, to confront the most powerful ruler on earth and demand freedom for slaves. The power to accomplish this impossible task came not from Moses himself, but from the presence that promised to go with him, to speak through him, to work through his inadequacy to display divine strength. The disciples received power at Pentecost, the ability to proclaim truth boldly, to perform signs and wonders, to establish communities that would outlast empires. The fire equipped them for tasks that were beyond human capacity, made them capable of more than they had been before the flames descended. The fire brings judgment and mercy in equal measure. The fire on Mount Carmel exposed false worship and vindicated truth, brought judgment on those who had led people astray, and mercy to those who were willing to turn back. The pattern is consistent throughout, fire burning away pretense and deception, revealing what is real and true, creating crises of decision that force people to choose whom they will serve and how they will live. Yet the judgment is always in service of mercy, clearing ground for new growth, making space for authentic relationship with the divine. The fire transforms identity. Every person who encountered the divine fire came away changed, not just in behavior, but in fundamental understanding of who they were and what they were meant to be. Moses went from hiding in the wilderness to leading a nation. Peter went from denying his teacher to boldly proclaiming truth before thousands. Paul went from persecutor to apostle. The transformation was total, affecting every aspect of life and thought and purpose. The fire did not just add something to who they were, but reconstituted them, burned away the old self, and brought forth the new. These patterns repeat because the God who manifests in fire and light does not change. The I Am who spoke from the burning bush is the same yesterday, today, and forever, constant in character, faithful in presence, unchanging in nature, even as the forms of manifestation adapt to different times and circumstances. The burning bush prepared Moses to understand the pillar of fire. The pillar of fire prepared Israel to recognize the glory cloud in the temple. The temple prepared people to comprehend the transfiguration. The transfiguration prepared the disciples for Pentecost. Each manifestation built on what came before, revealing more while remaining consistent with what had already been shown. The fire is both terrifying and inviting, inspiring fear and drawing people close simultaneously. Moses hid his face before the burning bush, overwhelmed by the holiness of what he was encountering, yet he could not leave, could not stop listening, could not refuse the call that came from the flame. The people of Israel were afraid of the pillar of fire, understanding that they were in the presence of something powerful and holy and utterly beyond their control. Yet they followed it, depended on it, found comfort in its constant presence. The disciples fell on their faces at the transfiguration, terrified by the voice from the cloud, yet they treasured the memory of that moment for the rest of their lives, drew strength from having witnessed glory that exceeded comprehension. This paradox of fear and attraction, of terror and comfort, points to something essential about the divine nature. God is not safe, not manageable, not containable within human categories, or controllable by human will. The fire burns with a power that could destroy, that demands respect and reverence, that will not be trifled with or treated casually. Yet the same fire that inspires fear also offers warmth, gives light in darkness, provides guidance and protection and presence. The holy is dangerous precisely because it is good, because it will not compromise with evil, because it burns away everything that is false and destructive and opposed to life. The fire appears in times of crisis and transition, at moments when old ways are ending and new possibilities are emerging, when people need clarity and courage and divine intervention to move forward. Moses encountered the burning bush when the people of Israel were in bondage, crying out for deliverance, needing someone to lead them to freedom. The pillar of fire appeared as they embarked on the wilderness journey, facing an unknown future, needing constant guidance and assurance of divine presence. The fire fell on Mount Carmel at a moment of spiritual crisis, when the people had lost their way, when false worship threatened to completely eclipse the truth. Pentecost came at the birth of a new movement, when disciples needed power to carry out an impossible mission. These crisis moments reveal something about divine timing and purpose. The fire comes not just when people want it, but when they need it, when circumstances demand intervention, when the stakes are high enough to require clear demonstration of divine presence and power. The fire is not entertainment or spectacle for its own sake, but purposeful revelation, given to accomplish specific things, to move the story forward, to transform people and circumstances in ways that serve larger purposes. The fire connects heaven and earth, creates a meeting point between the divine and the human, between the eternal and the temporal. The burning bush was ordinary desert vegetation touched by extraordinary presence. The pillar of fire moved through physical space, visible to natural eyes, yet manifested supernatural reality. The Transfiguration showed divine glory shining through human flesh. Every manifestation of divine fire involves this intersection, this moment when the boundary between heaven and earth becomes permeable, when the invisible becomes visible, when the eternal touches time. This intersection is what makes the encounters so powerful and so transformative. People are not just learning about God at a distance, but meeting God directly, experiencing presence rather than just hearing about it, being touched by fire rather than just reading about fire. The encounters are personal and immediate, engaging all the senses, affecting mind and heart and body together. Theory becomes experience, concept becomes encounter, and everything changes as a result. The fire is relational, always addressing specific people in specific circumstances, always personal, even when witnessed by crowds. Moses heard his name called from the burning bush, twice with intimacy and recognition. The voice from the cloud at the Transfiguration addressed the disciples directly, told them specifically to listen to the one standing before them. The tongues of flame at Pentecost divided and rested on each person individually, marking everyone as chosen, as called, as filled with the same Spirit. The fire is never generic or impersonal, but always knows the ones it touches, speaks to their specific needs and situations, calls them by name. Yet the personal nature of the fire does not make it private. What is experienced individually is always meant to be shared, to bless others, to serve purposes larger than personal transformation. Moses encountered the burning bush alone, but was sent to lead a people. Peter was filled with the Spirit at Pentecost and immediately stood up to address thousands. Paul was struck by light on the Damascus road in a private encounter, but spent the rest of his life proclaiming publicly what had been revealed to him personally. The fire touches individuals, but always for the sake of community, always to equip them for service, always to send them out to others with message and power. The fire promises presence that will not fail. "I will be with you," the voice said from the burning bush, and that promise undergirded everything that followed. The pillar of fire was constant, burning every night, never failing, never diminishing, always there when the people needed guidance or assurance. The Spirit given at Pentecost was described as a seal, a guarantee, an eternal presence that would never be withdrawn. The fire commits, stays, endures, refuses to abandon those it has called and filled and sent. This faithfulness of the fire stands in stark contrast to human inconstancy. People waver, doubt, fail, turn away, yet the fire continues to burn. Moses doubted his adequacy, yet the presence remained with him through 40 years of wilderness wandering. Israel complained and rebelled repeatedly, yet the pillar of fire continued to lead them. Peter denied knowing his teacher, yet the Spirit filled him at Pentecost and used him powerfully. The fire is more faithful than those it touches, more constant than those it calls, and this faithfulness is itself a form of grace, a demonstration that divine purposes do not depend on human perfection, but on divine commitment. The fire reveals glory, the weight and substance of divine reality, the truth that lies beneath appearances. The Transfiguration pulled back the veil and showed what was always true about the teacher, showed the glory that he had set aside to walk among people in ordinary form. The glory was not created in that moment, but revealed, made visible to eyes that were allowed to see past the surface to the reality beneath. Every manifestation of fire and light does something similar, reveals something of the divine glory, shows aspects of God's nature and character that might otherwise remain hidden or unknown. This glory is not about beauty alone, though the fire is certainly beautiful. It is about the weightiness of divine presence, the substance and reality of God, the truth that cannot be ignored or explained away. When fire falls from heaven, or light blazes from a human face, when flames rest on heads or voices speak from clouds, the glory is undeniable, immediate, overwhelming. People fall on their faces not because they have been told they should, but because the weight of glory presses them down, because the only appropriate response to such presence is prostration, is the acknowledgement of creaturehood before Creator. Yet the glory is also invitational, drawing people in even as it inspires awe. The burning bush attracted Moses, made him turn aside to investigate. The pillar of fire drew the Israelites forward, gave them something to follow. The transfiguration glory, despite terrifying the disciples, became a memory they treasured and drew strength from for the rest of their lives. The fire wants to be approached, not recklessly or casually, but with reverence and faith, with hearts open to transformation and lives ready to be redirected. The fire speaks of holiness, of the absolute otherness of God, the quality that sets the divine apart from all creation. When God spoke from the burning bush, the first command was to remove sandals, to recognize that this ground had become holy through divine presence. Holiness is not primarily a moral category, though it has moral implications. It is first an ontological reality, a statement about the nature of God as completely distinct from creation, as pure and perfect and untainted by any darkness or corruption. The fire burns so brightly because there is no admixture in it, no shadow, no compromise, nothing but pure divine essence. This holiness is simultaneously alienating and attractive. It shows humans how far they are from the divine standard, how flawed and incomplete and marred by failure and sin. Yet it also offers hope, because the fire that reveals holiness also offers to share it, to purify and transform, to make holy those who approach in faith. The fire that could destroy chooses instead to refine, to burn away impurities and leave gold, to work slowly and patiently to conform people to the image of the one who called them. Holiness is not just something to be admired in God, but something to be received and developed in people, and the fire is the means of that transformation. The fire speaks of love, though this might seem counterintuitive. Fire is often associated with judgment, with destruction, with anger. Yet the fire in these stories is always an expression of love, of God's passionate commitment to relationship with people, of the divine unwillingness to let creation languish in darkness and bondage and separation. The burning bush called Moses because God had seen the suffering of the people and was moved with compassion. The pillar of fire led the Israelites because God loved them and wanted to bring them safely home. The fire on Mount Carmel came to turn hearts back, to restore relationship, to save people from the consequences of false worship. Even judgment, when it comes through fire, is an expression of love, of God's refusal to let lies stand unchallenged, to allow evil to flourish unchecked, to permit people to destroy themselves and others without intervention. The fire that burns away deception and falsehood does so not from cruelty but from care, from the love that wants what is truly best for people, even when they resist, even when the process of burning away what is false is painful. The fire loves too much to leave people as they are, too deeply to allow them to settle for less than truth, too passionately to permit them to remain in bondage when freedom is possible. The fire points toward consummation, toward the ultimate fulfillment of all promises, toward the day when what has been revealed partially will be revealed fully, when what has been experienced in moments will become permanent reality. The Transfiguration was a preview, a glimpse of the glory that will one day be revealed completely. Pentecost was a down payment, the first fruits of a harvest that will eventually encompass all creation. Every manifestation of fire and light throughout history has been a sign pointing forward, an arrow indicating direction, a promise that what has begun will be completed. The fire burns in the present but leans toward the future, creates longing for what is not yet but will be, instills hope that sustains through difficulty and delay. Those who have encountered the fire carry within them an ache for its fullness, a desire for the day when the veil will be completely removed, when the glory will shine forth without restraint, when every tongue will confess, and every knee will bow before the one who is light and in whom there is no darkness at all. The fire they have tasted makes them hungry for the feast. The light they have glimpsed makes them long for the day. The presence they have experienced makes them yearn for the fullness of union. In every generation since these first encounters, people have continued to experience the fire in various ways. Not always as dramatically as Moses or Elijah, not always as visibly as the disciples at Pentecost, but really nonetheless. The fire of the Spirit continues to work in hearts, convicting of truth, empowering for service, comforting in sorrow, guiding through confusion. The pattern established in Scripture continues, adapted to new circumstances but consistent in its essential nature. Some encounter the fire in moments of worship, when the presence of God becomes palpable, when hearts are strangely warmed, when joy and awe mingle in experiences that transcend description. Others meet the fire in prayer, in the stillness of contemplation, in the silence where divine voice can be heard speaking words of love and call and commission. Still others find the fire in service, discovering as they minister to others that they are filled with power and wisdom beyond their own, that the presence goes with them and works through them in ways that surprise and humble them. The fire appears in times of crisis, just as it always has, bringing clarity and courage when circumstances threaten to overwhelm. People facing impossible situations discover reserves of strength they did not know they possessed, find peace that defies logic, experience grace that carries them through what should have broken them. The fire burns in martyrs who face death with confidence, in missionaries who leave comfort to serve in difficult places, in ordinary believers who make daily choices to follow truth even when costly. The fire works quietly most of the time, not in spectacular displays but in steady transformation, in the slow burning away of selfishness and pride, in the gradual conforming of hearts to the image of Christ. This hidden work of the fire is just as real and just as important as the dramatic manifestations, perhaps more so, because it affects daily life and shapes character in lasting ways. The fire purifies motives, softens hardened hearts, opens blind eyes, unstops deaf ears, makes the lame walk and the mute speak in spiritual senses that are as real as physical healing. The fire creates community, binds people together in shared experience of divine presence and common commitment to divine purposes. Those who have been touched by the fire recognize it in others, share a bond that transcends differences of culture or background or circumstance. The church at its best is a community of fire bearers, people who carry the flame within them and together create a brightness that illuminates the darkness, that draws others toward the warmth, that demonstrates the reality of the presence they proclaim. Yet the fire also challenges and disrupts, refuses to let people or communities settle into comfortable patterns that preserve human structures at the expense of divine purposes. The prophetic fire still burns, still speaks uncomfortable truths, still calls for change and repentance and renewal. The fire that comforts also disturbs, that builds up also burns away, that gives peace also demands transformation. To carry the fire is to live in creative tension, to know rest and unrest simultaneously, to experience the presence that satisfies and the longing that is never quite fulfilled in this life. The fire continues to call people by name, just as it called Moses from the burning bush, just as it struck Paul on the Damascus road. The calls come in different forms, whispered in prayer, spoken through scripture, mediated through circumstances or other people, or the still small voice of the Spirit within. Some are called to dramatic ministries, others to quiet service. Some are called to travel far, others to bloom where they are planted. Some are called to speak, others to listen, to pray, to support those who go. But every call is personal, specific, given by a God who knows each person intimately and has purposes for each life that fit uniquely with gifting and circumstance and temperament. The fire asks everything and gives everything in return. To follow where the fire leads is to abandon security, to release control, to trust that the presence that calls will also sustain. Moses gave up his quiet life as a shepherd. The disciples left their nets and families. Paul turned from the path of prestige and power. Every person who has truly encountered the fire has had to make similar choices, to count the cost and decide whether the pearl of great price is worth selling everything to obtain. Yet what is given in return exceeds what is sacrificed. Moses gained a purpose that transformed history. The disciples became the foundation of a movement that outlasted the empire that killed their teacher. Paul found a joy in suffering that he had never known in success. The mathematics of the kingdom are strange, the calculations counterintuitive, but the testimony of countless lives across centuries confirms that the fire gives more than it asks, that what is lost for the sake of following is nothing compared to what is gained in the presence and purpose and power of the one who calls. The fire burns still, waiting to be noticed, ready to speak, eager to transform. In every age, in every place, the divine presence seeks those who will turn aside like Moses, who will wait like the disciples, who will surrender like Paul. The forms may vary, the circumstances differ, but the essential invitation remains constant. Come to the fire. Let it burn away what is false. Let it illuminate what is true. Let it warm you when you are cold, guide you when you are lost, empower you when you are weak. Let it make you holy, make you loving, make you brave. The stories we have journeyed through tonight are not just ancient history, but living patterns, templates that continue to play out in countless lives. The burning bush still burns in 1,000 different forms, calling people from their ordinary tasks to extraordinary purposes. The pillar of fire still leads through wilderness places, providing light when darkness threatens to overwhelm. The fire still falls from heaven in answer to prayer, demonstrating divine power when human effort has exhausted itself. The tongues of flame still rest on those who wait in faith, filling them with power for witness and service. The light still transfigures, showing glimpses of glory that sustain through suffering and strengthen for the journey ahead. These are not merely stories to be admired or analysed from a distance, but invitations to be accepted, patterns to be entered into, realities to be experienced. The God who spoke from fire to Moses speaks still. The presence that led Israel through the wilderness goes before those who follow in faith today. The Spirit that descended at Pentecost continues to fill and empower. The glory revealed in Transfiguration remains available to those with eyes to see, though often in subtler forms. In the ordinary made extraordinary by divine presence, in the common made holy by divine touch, the fire invites you, dear listener, as it has invited every person who has heard these stories and felt their hearts stir with longing or recognition. Perhaps you have encountered the fire already, felt its warmth, known its power, experienced its transforming work in your own life. If so, these stories confirm what you have known, remind you that you are part of a long line of fire bearers, encourage you to continue following where the flame leads, even when the path is difficult or unclear. Or perhaps you have not yet encountered the fire directly, have only heard about it from others or read about it in ancient texts. These stories are an invitation to seek the fire for yourself, to ask that the divine presence that manifested so powerfully in Scripture would manifest in your own life as well. The fire is not reserved for heroes of faith or spiritual giants. It came to Moses the fugitive, to Peter the denier, to Paul the persecutor. It comes to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, transforming them not because of who they are, but because of who calls them and fills them and sends them. The seeking itself is part of the fire's work. The hunger for divine presence a sign that the Spirit is already at work, drawing you toward the flame, preparing you for encounter and transformation. To desire the fire is already to have been touched by it, for such desire does not arise naturally in human hearts, but is kindled by the presence that draws near even before we are aware of it. The longing you feel as you hear these stories, the ache for something more real and true and beautiful than what ordinary life offers, that is the fire beginning its work in you, calling you to turn aside, to pay attention, to open yourself to what wants to be given. The fire is patient, never forcing, never coercing, but always inviting, always available, always ready to burn brightly in lives that are willing to receive it. Some encounter it dramatically, like Paul struck blind on the road. Others meet it gradually, like Moses, who spent years in the wilderness before the burning bush appeared. There is no single path, no required method, no formula that guarantees encounter. The fire comes as gift, on divine initiative, in divine timing, but it does come to those who seek it with sincere hearts. As you drift now towards sleep, let these images rest gently in your consciousness. The burning bush with its eternal flame, the pillar of fire lighting the darkness, the blaze on Mount Carmel consuming water and stone, the tongues of flame dancing above the disciples, the transfigured face shining like the sun. Let these images become prayers, wordless longings for the presence they represent, openings through which the divine fire can enter your own life and begin or continue its transforming work. The fire burns through the night, just as it did for Israel in the wilderness. You are not alone in the darkness. The light shines still, guiding, protecting, warming, illuminating. The presence that spoke from flame to Moses, that led the people through the desert, that descended at Pentecost, that transfigured Christ on the mountain, that presence is with you now, surrounding you with care, holding you in love, watching over you as you rest. Let yourself relax completely, knowing that you are safe in the light of the fire. Your breathing slows, your body releases the tensions of the day, your mind drifts peacefully through the stories you have heard. The burning bush glows softly in your imagination, not harsh or demanding, but gentle and constant, its flame dancing slowly, hypnotically, inviting you into deeper rest. You are on holy ground, every moment, every place where divine presence dwells, and you can remove the sandals of striving, of anxious effort, and simply rest in the warmth of the fire. The pillar of fire stretches above you into the night sky, a beacon of constancy in a changing world. You do not need to know the way forward, do not need to see the entire path. The fire will guide one step at a time, will be there every morning and every evening, will never fail or diminish or abandon you. You can sleep peacefully, trusting the guidance, knowing that when you wake, the fire will still be burning, still leading, still offering its light for whatever lies ahead. The fire on Mount Carmel blazes in your heart, burning away doubts and fears, consuming the false idols that compete for your devotion, clarifying what is true and real and worthy of trust. The flames are cleansing, purifying, not destroying you, but refining you, burning away what is dross and leaving gold. You feel lighter as you rest, released from burdens you have carried, freed from weights you did not even know were there, as the fire does its gentle, thorough work. The tongues of flame from Pentecost rest softly on your head as you sleep, a blessing and a promise, a sign that you are seen, known, chosen, filled with presence and purpose. The fire does not demand anything of you right now, simply rests, waits, dwells, its warmth seeping into every part of you, healing, restoring, preparing you for whatever you are called to be and do. You are not alone, not abandoned, not forgotten. The fire marks you as beloved, as belonging, as home. The light of transfiguration shines gently behind your closed eyes, not bright enough to disturb your rest, but luminous enough to dispel darkness, to create a space of peace and safety where sleep can deepen without fear. This is the light that shone from Christ's face, the glory that blazes eternally but is usually veiled, and now it surrounds you, holds you, keeps you safe through the night. In this light, all other lights are revealed as shadows, all other hopes as echoes of this one true hope, all other loves as reflections of this perfect love. The fire and the light have guided us through this night, through deserts and mountains, through moments of crisis and clarity, through the long arc of history that bends toward the full revelation of divine glory. We have walked with Moses and Elijah, with Peter and Paul, with all who have encountered the burning presence and been forever changed. Their stories have become our stories, their encounters invitations to our own meeting with the flame. As you rest now in the warmth of the eternal fire, let its light sink deep into your spirit. Let it illumine the hidden places, the forgotten corners, the dark spots where fear or shame or sorrow have lingered unattended. The fire does not condemn but cleanses, does not expose to humiliate, but reveals to heal. It shines with the love that casts out fear, the truth that sets free, the grace that transforms without destroying. You can rest in its light without anxiety, without the need to hide or pretend or protect yourself. The fire knows you completely and loves you perfectly, and in that knowledge and that love you can be fully at peace. The night deepens around you, but the fire burns on, steady and sure. It has burned through countless nights, through the darkness of the wilderness and the darkness of persecution, through the long nights of waiting and the short nights of crisis. It has never gone out, never will go out, this eternal flame that is the visible sign of the invisible presence, the I am who was and is to come. You rest in the circle of its light, held by its warmth, assured by its constancy. Sleep now, dear one, surrounded by the fire and the light. Let the stories settle deep into your soul, where they can continue their work while you rest. The burning bush stands guard over your sleep, its flame never consuming, always sustaining. The pillar of fire lights your dreams, turning them toward hope and beauty and truth. The fire from heaven assures you that prayers are heard, that the divine responds, that you are not speaking into emptiness when you call out for help or guidance or presence. The tongues of flame bless you with their gifts, with peace and joy, and the deep knowing that you are loved beyond measure. The light of transfiguration promises that what you see now is not all that is, that glory waits to be revealed, that the best is yet to come. The fire burns low now, not going out but settling into glowing coals, the deep warmth that sustains through long nights, the steady heat that requires no tending but simply is, constant and reliable and true. Your breathing matches the slow rhythm of the fire, in and out, each breath a prayer, each heartbeat a hymn, each moment a gift received and released. You are held in the hand of the one who called the fire into being, who spoke light into darkness, who sustains all things by the word of power. Rest in the fire, sleep in the light. Let the ancient stories carry you into dreams, where presence meets longing, where heaven touches earth, where the eternal breaks into time with gentleness and grace. The fire watches over you through the night, burning steadily, silently, a guardian and guide, a comfort and companion. When morning comes, the fire will still be there, ready to lead you into a new day, to light your path, to warm your heart, to burn away what needs to be released and kindle what needs to grow. But for now, simply rest. The fire asks nothing of you but receptivity, openness, willingness to be warmed and lit and transformed in the slow, patient way that real change happens. You are safe, you are seen, you are loved. The fire and the light are with you, will always be with you, burning eternally, shining endlessly, holding you in the heart of the divine presence that is both the source and the goal of all our journeying. Sleep now, beloved. Sleep in the warmth of the fire. Sleep in the light of the presence. Sleep in the peace that passes understanding, the peace that comes from knowing you are held by love that will not let you go, guided by light that will not fail, warmed by fire that will not be extinguished. The I Am who spoke from the burning bush speaks still, whispering now in the depths of your heart. I am with you always. Rest in that promise. Trust in that presence. Sleep in that peace. The fire burns on through the night, faithful and true, and you are safe within its light. All is well. All shall be well. Rest now, and let the eternal flame keep watch over your sleep until the morning comes and the day breaks and the shadows flee away. The fire and the light have brought you to this place of rest, and they will keep you through the night, and they will lead you into tomorrow. Trust the fire. Trust the light. Trust the love that burns without consuming, that shines without fading, that holds without grasping. Peace be with you, dear listener. The fire has spoken, the light has shone, the stories have been told. Now rest in their truth, sleep in their promise, and let the eternal flame of divine presence warm and illumine and transform your dreams. Good night, and may the fire and the light be with you always, now and forever, world without end.